Shock and sadness after a shooting in Wichita's Old Town leaves one dead. Tonight, police still asking for your help to find that shooter.
We have Team 12 coverage tonight, bringing you the latest details on
In the early weeks of December in 2000, a murder spree would break out in Wichita, Kansas. What would later be known as the Wichita Massacre was a week-long series of brutal crimes that would leave the city in a state of fear and uncertainty. This week we will dive into the crimes and what drove the Carr brothers to commit them, as well as the twists and turns that occurred after conviction. Two brothers, Reginald and Jonathan Carr, were born and grew up in Dodge City, just 2.5 hours away from Wichita. Their early lives were filled with conflict between their parents, which often turned violent. Their mother having several other boyfriends, who would also be abusive. In many cases, reports say that they would sexually assault their other sisters. Eventually being moved to live with their equally abusive grandmother who didn't let up on the punishments, these brothers would show worrisome behavior outside of the home, with Reginald constantly getting in fights at school, which he had notably poor performance at. He was very protective of his brother and would defend him all throughout their time in high school. Afterwards, they would jump around from job to job, and the brothers would rack up quite a lengthy criminal record by the turn of the decade. Late in the year 2000, the brothers decided they had had enough. After arriving in Wichita in the late evening of December 8th, the crime spree would begin. First, they would rob a 23-year-old man named Andrew Schreiber and leave him wounded by gunshot. Stealing what they could find on him and in his car, but not killing the man, things would get a lot worse in days to come. 3 days later, on the 11th, the two brothers would stop a woman driving her car and attempt to rob her. After a struggle, they would end up shooting the 55-year-old cellist as she tried to escape them by driving off. She would die days later in the hospital from the gunshot. Not stopping there, on the 14th of December, almost a week after beginning their crime spree, they would commit their most gruesome crime yet. Choosing a house at random and breaking in, the brothers would find 5 people inside: Aaron Sander, Brad Haka, Heather Muller, Jason Beffort, and his girlfriend, a young woman identified as Holly G. The brothers would strip and bind the group and would search the house for all valuables to steal. Unfortunately, Jason Beffort was planning on proposing to his girlfriend that day, and the Carrs would find the engagement ring in the popcorn box they were eating out of. Knowing this, the brothers would force the group into different sexual acts before they boarded the group in Beffort's truck. The Carrs would drive them to various ATMs in order to obtain more cash, and ended up at a closed soccer complex. Here they would shoot all 5 of the group, execution style, in the back of the head. The Carrs would then drive over the dead bodies with the truck and drive back to the house to further search for valuables. However, what they didn't know is that Holly G would survive the shot. A plastic barrette would deflect the bullet towards the side of her head, causing non-fatal injuries. She would walk naked in the freezing cold for over a mile to get help. Once finding a house, and before help arrived, she would give a detailed report on the incident and a description of her attackers. These attacks would spark the community's attention, as local TV news stations would broadcast the description of Beffort's truck and the description Holly gave the police of the Carr brothers. This would lead to the brothers' arrest the following day. One of Reginald Carr's neighbors would recognize Beffort's truck parked in the apartment complex, prompting him to call the police. Another would do the same after he helped Reginald carry a flat-screen TV from his truck to his apartment just a little after. The police would arrive and promptly arrest Reginald, who would be identified by Andrew Schreiber as one of his robbers. Arresting Jonathan, on the other hand, would be much harder. Toni Green, the mother of Jonathan's then-girlfriend, would come home after feeling sick and would find Jonathan asleep on the couch. After making lunch and watching some TV, she would become uneasy about the man inside her house, as the news description of the suspect sounded a lot like him. She would pick up Jonathan's leather jacket and found a little jewelry box with a ring inside. She knew it could not be for her daughter since they had just recently met. The news mentioned a diamond ring was among the items the murderer stole, and the authorities were looking for a white Plymouth car that was suspected to be involved in the crimes. This happened to be the exact car Jonathan had parked out front of Green's home. She was slowly putting the pieces together, and she knew it had to have been him. Alerting her daughter to these facts, they would gather the kids and cross the street, finding safety in the neighbor's house, and promptly calling the police. As the police were arriving, the girls would see Jonathan on the porch overlooking the area, and said he began to run. The police would give chase and would catch up to him almost 2 blocks away, hiding between houses. They would find over $1,000 on his person, and Jonathan would be identified by the remaining witnesses as being involved in the burglary as well as the murders. Detectives would request a DNA warrant to link the brothers to these crimes. After giving nurses a sample of hair, blood, and saliva, Jonathan Carr would speak to homicide detective Kelly Otis. Carr would recall a murder that occurred just days before his own crime spree began, where 2 men shot and killed 4 teenagers and were eventually arrested. Carr would ask what happened to the boys that shot those kids. Otis replied, "They've been charged with capital murder." He responded, "What's that?" With her response, she would explain that anyone convicted of capital murder can get the death penalty, which is done by lethal injection. Carr would ask after a long pause, "Do you feel anything from that?" Otis would respond, "We've never been able to ask anyone about that." Jonathan being so concerned about his future well-being means he's in for a tough, long road ahead. After collecting the necessary evidence for trial, prosecutors would charge Jonathan and Reginald Carr with 113 charges, ranging from burglary, rape, and several counts of first-degree murder, and they would request the death penalty after the brothers were found guilty. The DA would state that the motive of these crimes seemed to be purely robbery-based. Due to the evidence gathered at the scene, paired with Andrew Schreiber's testimony, the brothers were found guilty after little deliberation from the jury. The judge would sentence both the brothers to death as well as life in prison. Throughout the next 2 decades, this decision would be appealed and reversed, and then reinstated after the Kansas Supreme Court would overturn the death penalty law in its entirety. But after the state attorney would appeal the decision, and once looked at again by the courts, they would uphold the constitutionality of the law, which returned the Carrs and others back to death row. Once again in 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court would overturn the Carr death sentences. The 6-justice majority said they did so because the trial judge failed to adequately separate the penalty proceedings for each of the defendants, as well as gave confusing and problematic jury instructions. After 2 long years of appeals from both sides, the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015, in a 8-1 ruling, would reinstate the death sentences, stating that the trial did not violate the Constitution. Just in January of 2022, the Kansas Supreme Court would back this decision and deny any appeals the brothers had left. Throughout the decades of debate, this case would become politicized by many, either saying this case should have been considered a hate crime due to the race of the victims and how brutal the killings were, and the other side saying a similar case that occurred just a week before the massacres would leave 4 black men dead and garnered little attention in the community. The arguments go both ways, but considering both of them, I don't see how any of them make sense. I truly believe these killings occurred due to the Carrs' disregard for life and their want for easy money. In the years after this tragedy, the Wichita community would see an uptick in gun sales and security system installation, in a thought to further protect themselves from these senseless acts. The Carr brothers are still incarcerated on death row at El Dorado Correctional Facility, which is a maximum security prison northeast of Wichita, where they await their death. That concludes the story of the Wichita Massacre. If you are interested in more scary, fascinating stories, make sure to watch last week's video.